Hello YouTube. Not a lot of people know this, but Robert Nozick was a trivialist. So what I just said about Robert Nozick there was not true. Don't believe everything you hear on the internet, okay? But what is true is that Robert Nozick defended some ideas, or took seriously some ideas, that fairly straightforwardly entail trivialism. And what I want to do in this video is explain the Nozickian road to trivialism. So, trivialism. Trivialism is the claim that all propositions are true. Pretty radical idea. Now, we can distinguish two different forms of trivialism. So, there's a distinction between semantic trivialism and metaphysical trivialism, right? Semantic trivialism is the view that trivialism is a feature of certain languages, but it doesn't draw any further conclusions about the world. So, for instance, Jody Azuni has argued that natural languages, or at least some natural languages like English, are trivial. So that is, there are certain features of the English language that make it so that in English all sentences are true. Here's a simple way that you can reach this kind of conclusion. Let's say that we endorse the following three claims. First, English has the expressive power to construct liar sentences. So this would be a sentence of the form, this sentence is false, right? So English has features like self-reference and a truth predicate, and that allows you to construct a sentence of the form, this sentence is false. Second, liar sentences are contradictory, right? There's just no consistent way to assign truth values to them. So you might say that if you assert this sentence is false, then you're going to end up assigning it to be both true and false. And then third, the underlying logic of English is classical. In classical logic, contradictions are explosive. From a contradiction, anything follows, right? If you assert a contradiction, you can derive anything at all. See my video on the principle of explosion for an explanation of this. If we endorse these three claims about English, we get the conclusion that English is trivial, right? In English, every sentence is true. However, the obvious inference from this point is that what this shows is simply that there's something defective about the English language. Perhaps the correct response to the triviality of English is just that we need to construct a formal language that avoids the commitment to trivialism, maybe by limiting the expressive power so that liar sentences can't be constructed within the language, or maybe by adopting a different logic, a paraconsistent logic in which contradictions are not explosive, right? So semantic trivialism, although it's interesting for a number of reasons, is not a particularly radical position. By contrast, the metaphysical trivialist holds that the world itself is trivial. The correct description of the world is that all propositions are true of it. So for the metaphysical trivialist, if it turns out that in some natural language like English every sentence is true, that's not a defect of English, right? In this respect, English correctly captures what the world is like. One way to think about the distinction between the semantic and metaphysical trivialist is the distinction between sentences and propositions. So sentences are items of natural language that express propositions. So we might say, for instance, that the English sentence, snow is white, and the German sentence, Schnee ist weiß, express the same proposition, namely, snow is white. One way to think about semantic trivialism is, okay, that's the claim that all sentences of a given natural language are true. Now, one way to think about metaphysical trivialism is this claim that all propositions are true, right? So the metaphysical trivialist is making a pretty extreme claim. The metaphysical trivialist is saying, like, the world is trivial. The world is such that every proposition is true of it. As far as I know, only one contemporary philosopher has explicitly defended trivialism, Paul Douglas Cabet. Trivialism is also arguably held by the Tiante Buddhist tradition. See my video on moral contradictions for more on this. I'll link all these videos in the comments. It turns out, however, that maybe Robert Nozick was committed to metaphysical trivialism. Now, to be clear, Nozick never explicitly endorsed metaphysical trivialism, and he probably wouldn't have if you had asked him. But it does follow in a fairly obvious way from certain metaphysical views that he does defend, or again, at least take seriously. So as I said, what I want to do here is explain how that works. Like, what is the road from, Robert Nozick's views to trivialism? But before I get to that, a quick advert. If you like my videos, you can support me on Patreon, and your support really does go a long way. If you can, anything helps a lot. And if you do sign up to the Patreon, I have bonus videos available there. Lots of videos of me talking more about philosophy, available on my Patreon. Or you could just send a donation via PayPal. Again, any support you can give the channel is very, very much appreciated, and it does help a great deal. So you could also just, like, subscribe, leave a comment, help the video in the algorithm. All right, well, now let's get back to the Nozickian road to trivialism. All right, so the first aspect of this is that Nozick makes a case for modal realism, for the view that all possible worlds exist. And again, I have a video series on modal realism that I'll link in the comments. So this comes up in his book Philosophical Explanations, where he is investigating the question, why is there something rather than nothing? He's looking for an explanation of why there is anything at all. Why does the universe exist? And he proposes this explanation that he calls fecundity. Now, fecundity is basically just his name for modal realism. Fecundity is the view that every possible world exists. Every possible world is realized. Every possible state of affairs obtains. And to be clear, what's being said here is every possible world exists in just the same sense that, this world exists, right? There's no metaphysical difference. So when we're talking about possible worlds here, we're not talking about like some sort of abstract entity or anything like that. So like if you imagine, the possible world where there are talking donkeys, well, that's just a world where there are talking donkeys. Like there are donkeys just like the donkeys in our world, except that they can talk, right? Okay, so now, like, let's suppose that we consider the set of fundamental laws and initial conditions of our universe and call this set C. And we ask the question, why C rather than D, where D describes some different set of fundamental laws and initial conditions? Well, if we accept fecundity, the answer is obvious. Both C and D are realized. So there is no fact of C rather than D. So when we ask this question, like, well, why does our universe have these laws rather than these laws, right? That sort of question contains an illegitimate presupposition. We happen to be in a C universe, but there's also a D universe. So there is no fact of C rather than D to be explained. So similarly then, why is there something rather than nothing? Well, there's both something and nothing. There are many worlds where there is something, and there's also the world where there is nothing. All possibilities are realized, so the empty world is realized also. Indeed, maybe there are many empty worlds. But certainly there's at least one empty world. There is no fact of something rather than nothing. Now, of course, we might instead ask the question, well, okay, but why isn't there only nothing? Like, why is there something? Why isn't there just nothing? But notice that sort of question would be to presuppose that nothingness is a kind of privileged state, that the empty world is the default world, and then we need some special mechanism for bringing about any other world. But why assume that any particular world is privileged over any other? The empty world is just one possibility among many. If fecundity is true, no particular possible world is privileged. Fecundity is a remarkably simple hypothesis from this point of view. It just treats all possibilities on a par. Now, it might be objected that Nozick's answer just pushes the question one step back, for we can ask, okay, why does fecundity hold? Why is it that all possibilities are realized? So we might contrast fecundity with a view that we can call near fecundity. Fecundity says all possible worlds are realized. Near fecundity says all possible worlds but one are realized. And now, don't we need to explain, well, yeah, but why fecundity rather than near fecundity? Nozick says, however, that this question again is illegitimate. There is no fact of fecundity rather than near fecundity, because both fecundity and near fecundity are realised. And this is because they're both realised in the following sense. Every possibility that is specified by fecundity obtains, and for that very reason, every possibility that is specified by near fecundity obtains. So near fecundity specifies like every possible world except one of them, right? But then all of those possible worlds that are specified as being realised by near fecundity, all of those possible worlds are in fact realised, right? So all of the possibilities that near fecundity says are realised, all of those possibilities do obtain, and they obtain as part of fecundity. So it makes no sense to ask, well, why fecundity rather than near fecundity? Near fecundity is realised as part of fecundity. A nice feature of fecundity is that it's capable of explanatory self-subsumption, that is to say, it explains itself. Fecundity says all possibilities are realised, or as Nozick puts it, for any P, if P states that some realm of possible worlds obtains, then P is true. But fecundity states that some realm of possible worlds obtains, namely, the realm of all possible worlds. Fecundity says all of them are realised. So, and fecundity is itself one of these possibilities. So fecundity explains itself. And for this reason, fecundity gives us a complete answer to the question, why is there something rather than nothing? Because it tells us, first, that the question contains an illegitimate presupposition, and secondly, fecundity explains itself. So it doesn't raise any further questions, right? Like when you ask the question, why fecundity? Why is fecundity true? What you see is, well, if fecundity is true, then fecundity tells you why fecundity is true. So, this is the route to a type of modal realism, to the view that all possible worlds exist. Now, there is actually a problem here, and this is a problem which Nozick doesn't address in philosophical explanations, or it doesn't actually address it anywhere, for that matter. We can put this problem in sort of two ways, right? Because you can say, well, hang on, I've just said that fecundity supplies this complete explanation, but is that really right? Because couldn't I ask, well, there's kind of two ways to put this question. First way to put it is to say, well, why is it that possibilities rather than impossibilities are realised? Right? Like, why is reality such that impossibilities do not obtain? Or a second way to put this is, like, for any world that you take to be impossible, what makes it impossible? Like, why shouldn't it be possible instead? Why is it impossible? And of course, if it were possible, it would obtain, right? So the point is that fecundity says, okay, all possible worlds are realised, but certainly we can imagine other kinds of worlds. We can imagine worlds beyond those worlds that are specified by fecundity, and then we can say, well, like, why don't they obtain? So we can consider extreme fecundity, which says all worlds are realised, possible or not, right? Just all states of affairs obtain, period. And now we have the question, why fecundity rather than extreme fecundity? And it looks like, look, now we have, this is a legitimate question, right? This is a legitimate explanatory problem. We can't say that this is illegitimate in the same way as, why fecundity rather than near fecundity, because extreme fecundity is not realised as part of fecundity. So we can't dismiss the question in the same kind of way. And notice that it probably won't really be very satisfying to say, well, the reason why fecundity rather than extreme fecundity is because extreme fecundity is impossible. That would just be kind of question begging here. The person proposing extreme fecundity is saying, like, if I believe extreme fecundity, I'm going to say impossible worlds are realised, right? So it would kind of be like objecting that fecundity doesn't hold on the ground that other possible worlds are not actual. So it's like, yeah, we know that other possible worlds are not actual, right? For the defender of fecundity, actuality is not required for existence. Similarly, the person proposing extreme fecundity, it's like, yeah, I know that the impossible worlds are not possible, right? They're impossible, right? But possibility is not required for existence. Um, so it looks like we have this question. Okay, we have this question that we can ask of reality, like why fecundity rather than extreme fecundity? And there's something here that, at the very least, what we can say is that fecundity doesn't supply the explanation to this question. This leaves an open question. By contrast, we can't similarly ask, well, why extreme fecundity rather than fecundity? After all, if extreme fecundity is true, then there is no fact of extreme fecundity rather than fecundity, because if extreme fecundity is true, both extreme fecundity and fecundity are realized, in the sense that every state that's specified by extreme fecundity obtains, and for that very reason, every state specified by fecundity obtains, right? Like, if all the worlds exist, then all the possible worlds exist. So it looks like Nozick's own arguments are kind of pushing him actually in the direction of extreme fecundity. Now, as I said, Nozick himself doesn't bring this point up, but in his later book Invariances, he endorses another view that provides a pretty straightforward answer to this problem I just raised, because in Invariances he defends Possibilism. And Possibilism is the view that everything is possible. Anything is possible. Again, I have a video on Possibilism. I'll link it in the comments. Now, the claim that anything is possible, this is meant in the sense of metaphysical possibility or absolute possibility. So let's say that I make the statement that it is impossible for any object to accelerate beyond the speed of light. So we want to say that this is true, but this, notice, is a constraint that's imposed by physical law, right? Like, when I say that it's impossible for anything to accelerate beyond the speed of light, what I'm taking for granted is that the physical laws are as they actually are. But you might think that the physical laws could have been different. I mean, you might think, okay, like, if there's a God, like, God could have brought about different physical laws. So, speaking unrestrictedly, it's possible for an object to accelerate beyond the speed of light because it's possible for the laws to have been different. Now, obviously, when we think about this possibility, we're not restricted by physical laws anymore. We're now in the domain of metaphysical possibility, right? We're in the domain of possibility in the broadest sense, right? Like, one way to think about this is, how could God have made the world? He might have made it with different physical laws, right? And then things could accelerate beyond the speed of light. Now, almost all philosophers who believe in metaphysical possibility think that there are constraints on metaphysical possibility. There are some ways that the world must be. So it is metaphysically necessary that 1 + 1 = 2. That's just not something that could have been otherwise. It's metaphysically necessary that there are no square circles. It's metaphysically necessary that water is H2O. Well, maybe. That one's a little more controversial. But a lot of people think it's metaphysically necessary that water is H2O. So, even God, he could bring it about that there's different physical laws, but even he could not bring it about that 1 + 1 = 57, or that, that there's a bunch of square circles, or that water is constituted by spaghetti rather than H2O, right? According to Possibilism, however, there are no constraints on metaphysical possibility. Absolutely nothing is ruled out. Nothing is necessary, okay? Anything is possible. There is a possible world where 1 + 1 = 57. There is a possible world where there are square circles. There is a possible world where water is constituted by spaghetti. Everything is possible, period. Robert Nozick was one of the very few philosophers who explicitly endorses Possibilism. Now, notice that if you endorse Possibilism, then extreme fecundity and fecundity are identical. Everything is possible, so there are no impossible worlds. So to say that every possible world is realized is, for the possibilist, identical to saying that every world is realized. To say that every possible state of affairs obtains is, for the possibilist, to say that every state of affairs obtains. By committing to fecundity and to possibilism, Nozick is already committed to extreme fecundity. And so with this, we have the materials for Nozickian trivialism. So what Nozick kind of defends, he defends first that every possible world is realized, and second, that everything is possible. So now consider the trivial world, the world at which every proposition is true. Well, it follows from Possibilism that the trivial world is a possible world, and given that it's a possible world, it follows from Fecundity that the trivial world exists. So Nozick is committed to the existence of the trivial world, the world at which every proposition is true. And so this is a kind of metaphysical trivialism. That there exists a world, that there exists the trivial world where every proposition is true. Now, I do want to make a clarification here. Philosophical Explanations is an explicitly exploratory book, as the title implies, and Nozick does explicitly say that he views some of the consequences of fecundity as unwelcome. He also argues that there may be ways to restrict the fecundity principle without sacrificing its explanatory power as an answer to the question of why there's anything at all. So, does Robert Nozick really hold these two views that entail trivialism? Well, maybe not. Nozick was, as I say, he was more of an exploratory philosopher, and I'm sure that Nozick would have probably rejected trivialism if you had put that question to him, but he presents these views, he kind of defends them, they entail trivialism. I think that's kind of interesting. That's what I wanted to talk about. I just think it's cool. I think it's cool that Robert Nozick at least kind of laid out a path that can take you in a trivialist direction. I think that's pretty cool. Now, what the conclusion is here is that the trivial world exists. That in itself is a pretty radical claim, but it's not totally crazy, right? Like it's not maximally insane. What we're saying is that there exists this maximal set of worlds, and one of those worlds is the trivial world. So yeah, I mean, there is a world at which 1 + 1 equals 2 equals 57. There is a world at which there are square circles. There is there is a world at which every proposition is true. That world really exists in the same way our world exists. But you might think, well, okay, the trivial world need not be the actual world. In this world, in this universe, it's not the case that every proposition is true. So the Nozickian trivialist is not committed to the claim that the actual world is trivial. It's not so clear, though, that trivialism can be quarantined to some other world, right? Given the claim, given fecundity, right? And so here's why. So in his defense of trivialism, Paul Cabet actually argues that possibilism in itself entails trivialism, right? So Cabet makes this argument that regardless of whether fecundity is true, right? Even if you're a possibilist, you're still going to be committed to trivialism. And the basic argument goes like this. So you can consider some world W at which trivialism is true, right? And then we can say, well, if possibilism is true, then W is a possible world. This just follows from the definition of possibilism. If possibilism is true, I mean, anything is possible, right? So of course there's going to be a possible world at which trivialism is true. Possibilism is true, trivialism is possible, so yeah, possible world at which trivialism is true. So if possibilism is true, W is a possible world. But then it is one, because in W every proposition is true, it follows that it is true in W that W is identical to the actual world, right? If every proposition is true, one of the true propositions is going to be W is identical to the actual world. I mean, of course, it will also be true that W is not identical to the actual world, but that's neither here nor there, really. One of the true propositions in the trivial world is W is identical to the actual world. But if W is identical to the actual world, and it is true in W that W is identical to the actual world, then trivialism is true. And the reason is just because if it's true in W that W is identical to the actual world, then what that means is W is identical to the actual world, right? An identity is symmetrical. If A is identical to B, then B is identical to A. And so, the actual world is identical to the trivial world. So the actual world is trivial. So the conclusion is that if possibilism is true, trivialism is true. Here's another route to the same conclusion. We can argue, okay, if possibilism is true, W is a possible world. For any proposition P, necessarily P is true at W. Because again, every proposition is true. So necessarily P for anything is going to be true at W. If necessarily P is true at a world, then P is true at every world accessible from that world. So P is true at every world accessible from W. So it is true, because every proposition is true at W, it is true at W that the actual world is accessible from W. And so this entails that if possibilism is true, then P is true at the actual world for any proposition P, right? So that just means that every proposition is true at the actual world. Okay, so that's sort of the argument, but there's a pretty straightforward response to all of this if you're a possibilist. And this is just that you reject the identification of possibility with possible worlds, right? So like this kind of standard view that I guess a lot of philosophers have, where they'll say, well, what it means to say that P is possible is P is true at some possible world. That's how a lot of philosophers understand possibility, but that's a bit controversial. I mean, possible worlds are a useful tool for thinking about modality, but we don't need to take it that modality is metaphysically grounded in possible worlds. And if you accept possibilism, you're going to have good independent reasons for denying that possibility is to be understood in these terms. Because the possibilist says anything is possible, right? But if anything is possible, then it will be possible that, for instance, P is true, but there is no world at which P is true. I mean, clearly you can't make sense of that if you're assuming that what it is for P to be possible is for P to be true at some possible world. Similarly, if anything is possible, it will be possible that there are no possible worlds. But we wouldn't want to say that what makes this possible is that there is a possible world at which it is true that there are no possible worlds. I mean, another example of this is a possibilist will say that it is possible for any proposition P that P is a necessary truth. Now, of course, nothing is actually a necessary truth, but if anything is possible, then necessary truths are possible. And again, on the sort of standard view, for it to be possible that necessarily P, that means there's a world at which necessarily P is true. So there's a world at which it is necessarily true that Santa Claus exists. But what it means for P to be necessary is that it is true in all possible worlds. So then you get the conclusion that Santa Claus exists is true in all possible worlds. A possibilist doesn't want to say that. So there's very good reasons for the possibilist to just say, no, we're not identifying possibility with truth in a possible world. And that's going to block those arguments for trivialism. However, if you combine possibilism with fecundity, then the situation is a bit different. Because you're going to take it that all these alternative possibilities really exist. So it's possible that there is a world at which trivialism is true, right? For the possibilist, even if you reject the identification of possibility with truth in a possible world, I mean, it will still be the case that it's possible that there is a trivial world. There is a world at which every proposition is true. And since every proposition is true at this world, it is true at this world that it is identical to the actual world. Now, of course, the possibilist can say, well, this doesn't imply anything about the actual world because this is a mere possibility, right? And so it's just possible, right? That's it. And, so it doesn't tell us anything about the actual world. But if you accept fecundity, then you're going to say that this world isn't merely possible, it really exists. There really exists an entity, a world, at which every proposition is true. And one of these true propositions is that this entity is identical to the actual world. So there exists an entity with the following properties, right? First, every proposition is true of this entity, and second, this entity is identical to the actual world. Well, now it just looks like, okay, the actual world is the trivial world. Or at least it's a very small step from that to the conclusion that the actual world is the trivial world. I mean, this is just a standard point about identity, right? If x is identical to y, then x and y are indiscernible. All the properties of x are properties of y, and vice versa. So, given that this trivial entity is identical to the actual world, all the properties of that trivial entity are the properties of the actual world. Every proposition true of the trivial entity is true of the actual world. One of the things that is true of the morning star is that it is identical to the evening star, so everything true of the morning star is true of the evening star. Since it is true of the morning star that it orbits the sun, it must be true of the evening star that it orbits the sun. Since it is true of the morning star that it's visible in the morning, it must be true of the evening star that it's visible in the morning. I mean, suppose we were to imagine some other star, call it the lunchtime star, and let's say we endorse Possibilism. So we're going to say, well, it's possible that the lunchtime star is identical to the morning star. But, that doesn't tell us anything about the actual world. We're just describing a possibility here. Okay, in the possible world where the lunchtime star and the morning star are identical, everything true of the lunchtime star is true of the morning star. But so what? That's just a possibility. That's not how things really are. But if we now say that the lunchtime star exists, and it's true of the lunchtime star that it's identical to the morning star, well, that kind of does seem to tell us something about the actual morning star, right? I mean, what else could we be saying? So it is with our world and the trivial world. Obviously, our world exists. Given fecundity plus possibilism, the trivial world also exists. And it is true of the trivial world that it is identical to our world. So our world is the trivial world. Okay, well, that's the Nozickian road to trivialism, a road that Nozick himself would no doubt have refused to go down. But he kind of defends fecundity. He certainly defends possibilism, and if you got those two views, then you got trivialism. So that's the end of that video. I hope that was interesting. And I'll see you next time. Bye for now.